He had lost faith in kindness well before he lost faith in God. By the time Ethan Coldwell rode into the small prairie town of Dustcreek, the only things he trusted were the cold weight of his revolver and the honest silence of open country. Everything else had already let him down at least once. So when a woman stepped out into the afternoon light and looked at him without flinching, he nearly pulled his horse around and rode straight back the way he'd come. A man carrying what he carried had no business being looked at that way. The September wind pushed dust down the length of Main Street as Ethan steered his dark roan Sage through town. It was 1876, late in the month, and Dustcreek wore its smallness plainly. A church with a whitewashed steeple that leaned slightly west. A general store whose painted sign had been fading for years. A saloon with swinging doors that hadn't been level in a long time. As he passed, people slowed and stopped. A man mid-sweep on the boardwalk let his broom go still. A woman gathered her little girl tight against her hip. A boy, holding a fishing pole, forgot to breathe. Ethan didn't take it personally. He was 34 years old, hollowed out by loss, and he moved through the world like bad weather moves through a valley. His long coat hung off shoulders that had once filled it better. A few days of stubble roughened his jaw. Beneath the brim of his hat, his eyes were pale and flat as winter sky. He had not come here to stay. He never stayed. 8 years back, he'd put his wife and his little boy in the ground outside Knoxville. Fever had taken them fast and without mercy. He'd tried going back to work after that, pinned his badge back on in Colorado, told himself that keeping order still meant something. But the law he'd believed in turned out to be riddled through with rot, and he walked away before it could touch him the same way. Since then, he'd been moving. Cattle drives, bounty work, short stints as a deputy in towns that forgot him the moment he left. Moving was simpler than remembering. His horse, Sage, was thirsty and footsore. Ethan guided him toward the livery stable at the far end of the street. That was when he noticed her. She was standing in the open doorway of the general store, half in shadow, half in light. Plain dress the color of summer wheat, dark red hair pinned neatly back. She wasn't pressed against the doorframe the way most people stepped back when they saw him. She stood square in the middle of it, watching him cross the street with an expression he couldn't immediately name. Not fear, something closer to curiosity, with a quiet edge of recognition. Their eyes met. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, some small, tight thing that had no business being there. She didn't look away. She held his gaze steady and unhurried, like she had all the time in the world and wasn't afraid of what she might find. He was the one who looked away first. That irritated him more than it should have. He touched his heels to Sage's sides and told himself what he always told himself. 3 days. Rest the horse, sleep somewhere dry, then ride. He dismounted in front of the stable, boots meeting packed earth, and handed off his coin to the stableman. But even as he worked the saddle loose with careful, practiced hands, he could feel her gaze still resting on him from across the street. And somewhere underneath the habit of leaving, something small and stubborn refused to go quiet. Ethan left Sage in the stable and came back out onto the street with every intention of not glancing toward the general store. He glanced. She was still there. The sun had moved enough to throw longer shadows across the boardwalk, and she had moved too, down off the step and out into the street, walking toward him with the unhurried ease of someone who had decided something and saw no reason to delay. He felt his hand drift toward his holster. Old reflex. He pulled it back. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was clear and even, no hesitation in it. He turned. "Yes, ma'am." She was closer to his age than he'd first guessed, late 20s maybe. Eyes that were a warm shade of green, steady and direct. Freckles scattered across her nose and cheeks. Her hands, when she offered one to shake, looked like hands that knew work. "Clara Blythe," she said, just like that, like they were being introduced at a church supper. "My father and I keep the general store, Blythe's, on the corner." Ethan looked at her outstretched hand for a moment longer than was polite. People didn't generally offer to shake his hand. They stepped around him like he was a hole in the road. But after a beat, he shifted his rifle and took it. Her grip was firm and warm and real in a way that caught him off guard. "Ethan Coldwell," he said, passing through. "I figured as much," she said. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close enough to one that it changed her whole face. "If you find yourself needing anything while you're here, supplies, directions, a meal that wasn't made in a saloon kitchen, we're open until 6. "I won't be a bother," Ethan said. "I didn't imagine you would be." It was such a simple thing to say. She had no reason to mean it. She didn't know him at all. But she said it like she did. And he had no idea what to do with that. "Much obliged," he managed. She gave him one small nod, satisfied, and turned back toward the store. Ethan stood there watching her go for several seconds longer than he intended. Something had shifted. He couldn't name it precisely, only felt it the way you feel a change in the weather before you can explain why. He adjusted his rifle strap and crossed to the boarding house on the opposite side of the saloon. A hand-painted sign over the door read, "Faro House, rooms available, decent and clean." Inside, a small, sharp-eyed woman stood at the front desk. Gray hair, posture like a schoolteacher who had heard every excuse. $1.75 a night, she said before he'd gotten 2 steps through the door. "Week in advance if you're staying more than 3 days. No drinking in the rooms, no firearms discharged on the premises, and supper is at 6 sharp. Miss it, and you miss it." "Any other rules?" Ethan asked. "Those are the important ones." Her name was Mrs. Farrow. He paid for 3 nights. 3, and not one more. The room upstairs was narrow and plain and clean. A single bed with an iron frame, a washstand, a wooden chair beside a window that looked down on Main Street. Ethan set his saddlebag on the floor and propped his rifle against the wall, and sat on the edge of the bed, and just let the quiet sit with him for a while. 8 years of moving. 8 years of convincing himself that putting distance between himself and people was the same thing as being safe. Down on the street, a bell rang as someone pushed into the general store. He sat listening to the sound of it fade. And then, without entirely meaning to, he found himself listening for her voice. He told himself he was going to the saloon purely for food, nothing else. By the time he stepped outside, the sun was low and orange over the roof lines, and lanterns were being lit along the boardwalk, one by one. The prairie wind had settled down to almost nothing, and the town had gone quiet in that particular way of small places after supper. Not empty, just drawn in close. The saloon was called the Gray Mare. Inside, it was exactly what he expected. Tobacco smoke, whiskey, men playing cards with the focused silence of people who'd rather not talk about their day. A piano player in the corner was giving something a fair try. Ethan took a stool at the far end of the bar with his back to the wall and ordered whiskey and whatever was on the stove. He was halfway through a bowl of decent beef stew when the saloon doors opened and the room shifted the way rooms shift when someone with authority walks in. Ethan didn't look up right away. He heard the footsteps, measured and deliberate, coming his direction. "Evening," said a voice. "Sheriff," Ethan replied without looking up. The man who settled onto the next stool was somewhere in his mid-50s, lean without being thin. Eyes that moved carefully around a room and came to rest with purpose. A badge on his vest that looked like it had been worn a long time. "Frank Deering," the sheriff said. "I make a point of knowing who comes through." Ethan met his eyes then. "Ethan Coldwell. 3 nights, then I move on." Deering studied him the way experienced men study other experienced men, looking not at the surface, but at what the surface is hiding. "You carry like someone who's used it," he said. "When I've had to. Any reason I'd have to worry about that while you're here?" "No." The sheriff was quiet for a moment. "You've got a particular look about you," he said finally. "Seen it before. Usually on men who left something behind somewhere, and haven't figured out what to do about it. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's my business. Fair enough, Deering said without offense. Long as it stays that way. Whatever followed you before has a habit of following you here. That becomes my concern. Nothing's following me. Then we'll get along fine. The sheriff stood, set a coin on the bar for his drink. Dustcreek's a good town. The people here are worth something. I intend to keep it that way. He said it plain, without menace, just a fact. Ethan believed him. Somehow, that made it worse. After Deering left, Ethan finished his meal slowly and stepped out into the night. The sky overhead was enormous and thick with stars, the way prairie skies get without city light to wash them out. He walked toward Farrow House with his hands in his pockets. As he passed the general store, he noticed the lamp still burning in the front window. Through the glass, he could see Clara at the counter, bent over a ledger with a pencil tucked behind one ear. Her hair had loosened slightly from where she'd pinned it. She had the expression of someone doing a task she'd done 1,000 times and still cared about getting right. Ethan stopped walking. He hadn't meant to. She looked up, saw him through the glass. This time the expression on her face was different, less curious, more certain, like she'd been expecting him to pass at exactly this moment and had already decided something about what it meant. He lifted 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. She gave him a small, unhurried smile, the kind that isn't performed. He walked on. But upstairs in his room, sitting in the chair by the dark window long after the town had gone quiet, the feeling he'd had in his chest that afternoon was still there. He'd gotten good at ignoring that feeling over the years. It had taken some effort. Tonight it wasn't cooperating. The nightmares came after midnight, when they always came. His wife's face, his son's weight in his arms, small and feverish, and then still. He woke to a gray pre-dawn ceiling and the feeling of a room that belonged to no one. For a moment he didn't know where he was. Then the sounds came through the window. A rooster, a cart on the road, someone splitting wood in the cool morning air. Ordinary life. He washed his face, dressed, and went down to breakfast. Mrs. Farrow put a plate of eggs and strong coffee in front of him and sat herself down across the desk without being invited. Miss Blythe stopped by first thing this morning, she said. Asked whether you might come by the store today. Ethan looked up from his coffee. She say what for? She did not. He looked back down. Avoiding it would be the cleaner choice, but small towns had a way of noticing avoidance, and he'd already been noticed more than he preferred. I'll stop by, he said. Mrs. Farrow's expression didn't change, but something in it suggested she'd expected exactly that answer. The morning air had a bite to it. He stopped at the livery first. Sage nickered and pushed his nose against Ethan's shoulder. You're supposed to be the sensible one, Ethan muttered. The horse blinked. No opinion offered. He walked to Blythe's general store. The bell above the door announced him. The smell inside was warm and layered. Ground coffee, flour, harness leather, dried herbs. Clara was behind the counter with an open crate in front of her, checking inventory against a handwritten list. She looked up when he came in, and something in her expression eased, like a small tension let go. Mr. Coldwell, I wasn't sure you'd come. You sent word, he said. What is it you needed? She set down her pencil. There's a harvest gathering, Saturday. The whole town turns out. Food, fiddle music, some dancing. I'd like you to come. He blinked. Why? Because you're new here, she said. And because nobody ought to spend Saturday night alone in a rented room when there's somewhere better to be. And because you look like someone who's been a long time without a good evening. He searched her face for something condescending in that. He didn't find it. I'm not a dancer, he said. Neither am I, particularly. But there's food, and I'd enjoy the company. He should have said no. What he said instead was, all right. Her smile was quick and genuine and went straight through whatever he'd been building. Saturday, she said. It starts at sundown. He stepped back out into the morning, with the distinct feeling that the ground had shifted slightly under his feet. Saturday came clear and still, the kind of autumn day the prairie offers now and then as an apology for everything else. Ethan stood in front of the small mirror in his room and looked at himself for a long moment. He had shaved, first time since riding in. He told himself it was basic courtesy and not anything else. You gave your word. That's sufficient. The gathering was set up on the open ground behind the church, under a cluster of cottonwoods whose leaves had gone gold. By the time Ethan arrived, it was already well underway. Long tables being lifted into place, women unfolding cloths and setting out jars and covered dishes, children running in every direction with the specific energy of children who have been indoors all week. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat, and something sweet he couldn't identify from a distance. Clara spotted him from across the yard. She was wearing a dress the color of sage, her hair braided and pinned differently than during the week. She walked toward him directly, without hesitation. You came, she said. Said I would. She pressed one end of a long table into his hands without preamble. Then make yourself useful. For the next 2 hours, he worked alongside the men of Dustcreek, hauling tables and benches, stringing paper lanterns between the cottonwood branches. The men introduced themselves easily and asked him nothing uncomfortable. Clem the blacksmith, Porter, who ran the grain store, a young farmer named Will, who talked about his wheat harvest with the particular pride of someone who'd bet everything on it and won. They simply worked beside him and let him be part of what was happening. He hadn't expected that to feel like anything. It did. At sunset, the yard was transformed. Lantern light warm on every surface. Tables covered with more food than he'd seen in one place in years. A fiddler and a guitarist started up from the platform, and couples drifted together on the open ground. Laughter moved through the crowd in waves. Ethan stayed at the edges, the way he always did. Clara found him there with 2 plates and a matter-of-fact expression. You've been standing like you're about to leave for the last 10 minutes, she said. Sit down and eat. They settled on a bench a little apart from the main noise. The food was extraordinary. He ate more than he'd intended. You're good company when you're not guarding yourself, she said at some point. He glanced at her. Is it that obvious? A little, she said, but not unkindly. When the music shifted into something faster, couples formed quickly. Clara stood. Dance with me. He nearly choked on his cider. I told you I don't dance. That's different than can't. Her hand stayed out, patient. He looked at it. Every reasonable thing in him said to decline. He took it. He was as bad at dancing as he'd claimed. He stepped on her foot within the first 8 counts. She laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and guided him through the rest of it, with a steady hand and no condescension whatsoever. Somewhere in the middle of it, he stopped thinking about what his feet were doing, and just moved. 3 minutes, maybe less. When the music ended, they stood in the lantern light, slightly breathless, alive. And somewhere deep inside, something that had been sealed up in Ethan Coldwell for a very long time, quietly cracked open. He tried to return to the edges after that first dance. The town had other ideas. Men he'd spent the afternoon working beside pulled him into conversation. The farmer Will's wife pressed a second plate on him. A cluster of children materialized and wanted to know about his horse and whether he'd ever shot anyone, and what the biggest city he'd ever been to was, all approximately simultaneously. He answered honestly, and they seemed satisfied. He was not invisible here. That was the thing he kept brushing up against. He had spent 8 years perfecting the art of moving through places without leaving a mark, without being incorporated. Dustcreek didn't seem to have received that message. Sheriff Deering appeared beside him with 2 cups of cider, unhurried. They stood together, watching the dancers for a moment. She's not ordinary, Deering said quietly. No, Ethan agreed. Her mother died 4 years ago. A lot of women her age would have found a reason to move east, find something easier. She didn't. Helped her father keep the store going. Helped organize things when the town needed organizing. People here lean on her, and she doesn't complain about the weight. She deserves someone who shows up, Deering said. Consistently. Not someone passing through on a 3-day count. I know that, Ethan said. Then you know I'm not saying it as a threat. The sheriff looked at him directly. I'm saying it as someone who thinks you might be worth more than you're currently giving yourself credit for. I leave tomorrow, Ethan said. Deering sipped his cider. That what you actually want? He didn't answer. The sheriff nodded once, like the silence was sufficient, and moved on. Later, as the lanterns burned lower and families drifted homeward, Ethan stayed to help break things down, folding tablecloths, carrying benches back to the church porch. Clara worked beside him in the comfortable way of someone who doesn't feel the need to fill every moment with talk. Her hair had come mostly loose from its pins. I'm glad you came, she said when most of the work was done. It was a good night. The words were simpler than what he meant. She looked at him steadily in the last of the lantern light. Will you stop by before you ride out? I'd rather say a proper goodbye than watch you disappear. All right, he said. I'll stop by. Walking back through the empty streets, the sky enormous above him, he thought about what he'd told himself in that livery yard his first day. 3 days, then move on. It had seemed obvious, automatic, the way everything had been automatic for 8 years. Tonight, nothing felt automatic. In his room, he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his packed saddlebag on the floor. He could be in the saddle before first light. Clean break. The merciful thing for everyone involved. He'd done it enough times to know exactly how it felt. That particular hollow efficiency of leaving before you'd given yourself time to care. He closed his eyes. He saw her reach for his hand on the dance floor. He sat there for a long time. He was awake before the roosters. The room was gray and cold, and he lay on his back staring at the ceiling, working out exactly what kind of fool he was becoming. He got up, washed, put on his cleanest shirt, stood in front of the cracked mirror and didn't quite recognize what he saw. Less like a man in transit, more like someone who'd arrived somewhere and was only now realizing it. Downstairs, Mrs. Farrow put coffee in front of him and waited. Might need the room another few days, he said. She refilled his cup without comment. That was all. After breakfast, he went to the livery. Sage pressed his nose into Ethan's palm. Week's board, Ethan said to the stableman. Maybe more. The words came out steadier than he expected. He stood in the stable doorway for a moment after and let that settle. He hadn't extended a stay in longer than he could remember. His chest felt strange. Not bad strange, just strange. He walked to Blythe's. The bell announced him. Clara was stacking cans near the front window and looked over her shoulder when she heard it. Something moved across her face quickly. Something that might have been worry. And then she saw his expression. You're still here, she said. Paid the livery through next week, he said. If there's work around the store, I can help. I'm not looking for wages, just something useful to do. She studied him for a moment. Then she called toward the back. Papa? Her father, Mr. Blythe, came out from the storage room. A tall man, gone thin with age, with his daughter's steady eyes and the deliberate movements of someone whose back had been arguing with him for years. He shook Ethan's hand with a grip that surprised him. Heard about you, Blythe said. Clara speaks well of you. Don't know that I deserve it. She doesn't say things she doesn't mean, Blythe said simply. Stockroom needs reorganizing. Been meaning to do it for 6 months. You handy with a hammer? Yes, sir. Good. Get started, and we'll talk about what else needs doing. The storage room was a testament to accumulated disorder. Sacks stacked on boxes, tools leaned against flour barrels, inventory mixed with no discernible logic. Ethan worked through it steadily, tearing out the old shelving and building new in its place, moving everything into an order that made sense. Clara came in and out, handing him nails and wood and coffee, asking practical questions and offering opinions that were worth having. He noticed more small things about her. The way she worked through problems out loud. The way she didn't apologize for knowing what she wanted. That afternoon, Sheriff Deering looked in. "Word travels," he said, without being asked. "I'm down a deputy. Have been for 2 months." He watched Ethan fit a shelf board into place. "Position's yours if you want it." Ethan didn't answer immediately. A badge meant something he'd walked away from. It meant being the thing that stood between people and what wanted to hurt them. And he'd told himself 8 years ago that he was no longer built for that. "Don't need an answer today," Deering said.
Just wanted it said.
When he was gone, Ethan stood in the storeroom with his hands on the new shelving and felt the silence around the words. "Town's better with you in it." He turned that over carefully. The way you turn something fragile to make sure it's real. He went back out to the front room. Clara glanced at him. "You've got a decision on your face," she said. "Maybe," he said. "You're staying, though." She said it quietly. Not a challenge, just a thing she could see. He looked at the shelves he'd built, at the order he'd made out of the chaos, at the town outside the window, which had let him work alongside it without demanding anything he wasn't ready to give. "Yeah," he said. "I am." Something opened in her expression then. Not triumph, just relief and warmth. Uncomplicated and genuine. He'd forgotten people could look like that. The trouble came on a Tuesday, which is when trouble usually comes. Ordinary and without warning. The afternoon was flat and still, the kind of quiet that has a sound to it if you know how to listen. Ethan was in the storeroom fitting the last shelf bracket into place when the church bell started ringing wrong. Not the measured toll of the hour, frantic and hard. Alarm. He was in the main room before the echo had faded. Clara was already at the front window. A rider came hard from the western road, his horse blowing white foam, and practically fell off outside the sheriff's office. Ethan read the whole thing in about 2 seconds and felt his stomach drop. Deering was in the street before Ethan reached the door, and within minutes the news had moved through the town like a cold wind. The Collard brothers, 5 of them, known from the Panhandle to the border, had hit a bank 2 towns north, shot 2 men. Witnesses put them heading south, at speed. "They'll come through here," Deering said to the group of men who had gathered. "Or around. Either way, I want this town ready." He met eyes with Ethan across the circle. Ethan turned back inside. Clara was right behind him. "How bad?" she asked quietly. "As bad as that kind gets." He checked his revolver by feel, automatically, counted the rifle rounds in his coat pocket. Clara watched him with an expression that was working hard to stay steady. "You're going out there," she said. "Yes." She opened her mouth, closed it, then I'll get Papa to bolt the back." Deering handed him a badge in the street. The metal sat heavier in Ethan's palm than he remembered from the last time. He pinned it to his vest, took his position at the north end of Main Street behind a water trough with a good sightline, and waited. He didn't have to wait long. 5 riders at a hard canter, raising dust, showing no sign of slowing. The leader, thick through the chest, an old scar running jaw to ear, was already reading the street as he came in, calculating. They slowed when they saw the men positioned. Didn't stop. "Ride through or turn back," Deering said, stepping into the road. His voice carried like he meant it. The leader's answer was to pull iron. What came after was not like the stories. It was loud and close and fast and ugly. Gunfire tore through the false front of the hardware store. Glass broke. Ethan came up from behind the trough, fired twice. The leader was off his mount and moving for the bank before the second shot had echoed. Ethan ran. Inside the bank, the light was low and sharp with gun smoke. He took a shotgun blast through the doorframe that missed him by 4 inches and went flat. came up behind an overturned desk. The second man was ramming shells into a revolver. Ethan disarmed him. The leader had the bank manager, an older man named Horace Pruitt, by the collar with a gun at his temple. "Easy," the man said. His voice was almost pleasant. "Set it down, deputy." Ethan held still. The shot was possible. It was also not possible. He set the rifle down slowly. Now the sidearm. Then, from the back stairs, a voice, flat and absolutely certain. "Take your hand off him." Every head turned. Clara, standing on the landing with a rifle leveled, braced against her shoulder like she knew what she was doing. Because she did. "The lady," the outlaw sneered, starting to turn. He never finished. Ethan drew and fired in the same motion. The man's gun hand went out from under him. He charged, huge and furious, and they went through a desk together in a crash of wood and scattered papers. The outlaw's hands found Ethan's throat. Pressure tightened. Vision blurred. He got a hand free, drove his elbow, twisted, found his revolver on the floor. The fight ended. Ethan lay on the bank floor in the settling dust and smoke, tasting blood, listening to his own breathing and deciding it was an acceptable sound. Clara was beside him almost immediately, hands on his face. "Look at me," she said. "Ethan!" He looked. "You were supposed to be in the store," he said. "I was." Her voice had a slight tremor she was visibly controlling. "And then I wasn't." Deering came through the door at a run, took in the scene, and exhaled long and slow. "It's done," he said. "The others are down." Ethan let his head rest back against the floor and closed his eyes for just a moment. He heard Clara's sharp intake of breath. "How bad?" she asked Deering. "He'll be all right, but we're getting the doctor." The cracked ribs made themselves known fully about an hour later in Dr. Avery's examination room, along with a cut above his eyebrow that required 4 stitches and a split lip that the doctor said was cosmetically unfortunate but not structurally significant. Clara sat in the chair by the wall the entire time. She didn't look away from anything. That, in its own way, was harder to take than the stitches. When the doctor stepped out to give them privacy, the room was quiet enough that Ethan could hear the fiddle someone had started playing down the street, too fast and ragged with relief. "You could have been killed," Clara said. She said it carefully, like she'd been holding it back while the doctor was present. "You took a shot at an armed outlaw on a staircase," Ethan said. "I could say the same thing to you." "It's different." "It really isn't." She crossed the room and sat in the chair closer to him, her hands in her lap. "I've spent a long time building something stable," she said finally. "This store, this town. I don't need it to be exciting. I just need it to be real. And then you rode in, and She stopped. "I don't know how you do it," she said. "How you carry all of that and keep moving. I don't know that I do it well." She looked at him. "You're still here?" "I'm still here," he agreed. "I'm not asking you for anything," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking you to be something you're not or to promise something you can't keep." "Clara." She stopped. "I'm not leaving," he said. "I stopped wanting to leave somewhere around the first dance." She was quiet for long enough that he wondered if he'd said it wrong. Then she leaned forward and put her forehead against his, carefully avoiding the stitched cut, and stayed there. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." He stayed 2 days in the doctor's spare room. The town had decided he was theirs and intended to act on it. Soup from one household, bread from another. The blacksmith, Clem, stopped by to shake his hand and stayed for an hour talking about nothing in particular. The farmer, Will's children, left a drawing of what appeared to be Ethan on a horse, though some artistic liberties had been taken with the proportions. He had been unreachable for 8 years. Now he couldn't quite manage it. And he found that he didn't especially want to. On the third day, Deering came by, turned his hat in his hands for a moment, and then said what he'd come to say. "What you did in that bank, that wasn't nothing. The deputy job is yours if you want it. Real job. Not temporary." Ethan looked at the badge the sheriff set on the side table. He remembered the last time he'd worn one. He remembered putting it down and walking out, and the vast, cold relief of having nothing left to be responsible for. He didn't feel that way now. "I'll take it," he said. Something in Deering's face settled. "Good," he said simply. "Get well first." Clara came that afternoon, as she had every day. She sat beside him and read for a while from a newspaper, and then set it down and looked at him. "Deering told me," she said. "Did you mind?" "No." "Are you sure?" "Yes," he said. "For the first time in a long time. Yes." She nodded slowly. There was something private in her expression. He was starting to be able to read some of what went on there. "Don't scare me like that again," she said. "I'll do my best." "That's not a promise." "No," he agreed. "But I'll do my best." Spring found Dustcreek gently, the way it finds prairie towns. Slow green at the edges of things, then all at once. Ethan healed along with the season. The nightmares became less frequent and less loud. The badge grew comfortable on his vest in the way tools grow comfortable in experienced hands. He learned the town the way you learn a place you intend to keep. The names of every family on every street. Which fences gave trouble after hard rain. Which horses were skittish on market days. He fixed things when they needed fixing. He was there when it mattered. That turned out to be the whole job. Clara opened a reading room in the side space of the general store in March. 2 long shelves of donated books, a table, 3 chairs, a lamp. She was there most evenings, helping people through difficult words, ordering new books when she could afford them. Ethan stopped by most evenings. She made coffee. They talked, or they didn't. Either was fine. In early April, he filed a land claim on 30 acres east of town along a good creek. And in the last week of the month, he started building. He brought her out one evening when the framework was up, the sky burning out to deep orange over the prairie. She walked the outline of it slowly, one hand trailing along the raw lumber. 2 rooms, he said. Porch looking west. Cellar. Room to add on. If that seems like something worth building. She turned. He had the ring already out. Silver, simply made, with a small dark blue stone that caught sunlight like a promise. I came here with no intention of staying, he said. I'd convinced myself the life I'd had before was the only one I'd get, that losing it meant I was done, that there was something wrong with wanting more than that. But you showed me something different. You saw a man worth saving when I couldn't see him myself. He went to one knee in the grass. I love you, Clara. Not because you saved me, though you did more than once and in more ways than one, but because being near you makes me want to be the kind of man who stays. Will you marry me? Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. They were married in June under the cottonwoods that had been strung with lanterns for the harvest gathering where they'd danced. Mister? Blythe walked his daughter across the grass with the particular careful pride of a man who has been waiting a long time to hand something precious to someone he trusts. Deering stood beside Ethan. When Ethan kissed his wife, the fiddler started up, and half the town cheered. Later that fall, in the house he'd built room by room through the summer, Ethan stood on the porch in the early dark, watching the last of the light leave the sky. Clara came out and stood beside him, close enough that their arms touched. Are you happy? She asked. He looked at the land, the town lights flickering in the distance, the badge resting warm against his chest. Then he looked at her. For the first time in a long time, he said, I'm not running. He pulled her close. The prairie stretched out dark and wide in every direction. The same land that had seemed empty when he rode in. It wasn't empty now. he was home. He had, against every reasonable expectation, made his way home.